Hey everybody, it's Albert. As some of you may know, I'm working on this project, kind of a long-term one, dealing with the whole pagan parallels issue is promoted in the film Zeitgeist and other areas. And I'm working on a book, which I'm hoping to have it written by the end of this year, early next year, and edited and then published and sometime early next year, maybe, hopefully. But I've been looking through stuff, and every once in a while I'll just come across one, and I just kind of, it's amusing, and I don't really want to wait to just point this out because it's funny. It's not a major thing, but I think it illustrates the lack of scholarship in these areas with a lot of these people, and I just found the whole thing really funny, frankly. And this one is going to deal with the story of Mises of Egypt. Now, I've done a video on this before, and I'll put a link in the description box. And I'm not going to go through all that stuff. I'm just going to briefly mention what I had found earlier. Essentially, they're trying to come up with this parallel to Moses, saying Moses was based on this earlier figure, Mises. And the source they give is a crackpot author who wrote a book in the early 70s, both the Charlie S./D.M. Murdoch and the film cited this person as the source. That person cited an unnamed Orphic hymn, didn't say what hymn it was. In fact, none of these authors, as far as I know, has ever identified the Orphic hymn in question. So I decided to try to figure out what went on, so I went back to some 19th century pagan parallel backers, and found Mises mentioned a couple times, once by Percy Graves of 16 Crucified Saviors fame in another book. He identified Mises of Egypt. Another by Robert Taylor and Diegesis. He identified more associated with Asia Minor. And also both mentioned this Orphic hymn. Still, no one actually quotes the hymn at all. You'll never find this quoted by any of these people. So I just went through the Orphic hymns. Now, as I pointed out in the video, my original video, there's a number of problems here. One is, although the original Orphic movement goes back 400 or 500 BC, the hymns we have really aren't from there. The Orphic hymns back then, all we have are fragments. There was a revival of Orphism in late antiquity, begin 1st to 3rd centuries AD, and that's the Orphic hymns we have, basically, the most of them. So not only does this story long postdate the story of Moses, even if this hymn exists, not only would it postdate the story of Moses, it more than likely postdates the story of Jesus, which makes a Moses copycat highly unlikely. Now, I also pointed out, basically if you go through these hymns, there's only one real candidate, and the only way you can interpret it the way they do is by misunderstanding everything. Because basically what happens is you have Dionysus or Bacchus mentioned, as they mention Bacchus, who's Dionysus, of course. They mention, they use the word Thesmophorus or lawgiver, which mean, Mises, and the word, and Mises is also mentioned. There's a Mises mentioned, so you got Mises, you got lawgiver, you got Bacchus, and they're thinking Moses, lawgiver, Mises, lawgiver, Bacchus, Mises, Bacchus, lawgiver. No, as I pointed out, this only works if you equate all these figures as being the same, and in fact they're not. They're calling different people at different times, as is common in a lot of the Orphic hymns. Thesmophorus, lawgiver, is actually a title ascribed to Demeter. In fact, they mention one of Demeter's sub-gods, kind of one of the ones associated with her, the minor gods, Iacchus. So obviously, and they put Iacchus with Demeter, so with Thesmophorus, so that obviously you have that there. And Mises is actually a goddess in Asia Minor. Now, they may not have known this sometime in the 17th century or something. A lot of this stuff, some of the stuff about gods in Asia Minor were not really settled until they started doing archaeology in that region extensively, and they figured out a lot of these things. So that, which is understandable. But obviously, this whole story just kind of fell apart at that point. It's obvious the mistakes being made. Now, what's interesting is I there's a book published last year. It was, at least it's copyrighted 2009, so I'm assuming it's published in the last year or so, titled "The Gospel According to Acharya S." by Acharya S/D. Murdoch. And what's interesting is that, like, originally I wasn't planning on buying this as part of the research I'm doing, because I figured, it's basically, this is my opinion on things. But I figured, well, maybe I'll just get it just in case there's something there that's worth noting, and just kind of skim through it and see if I can see if it sort of, there's any further explanation. Well, sure enough, there is. What's amusing is there's actually if you go around page 71 through 73, 74 in this book, she basically trying to shore up the Mises of Egypt story. And of course, what she does is cites a bunch of not only 17th and 18th, but actually not only 18th and 19th century authors, but actually 17th century authors. So I mean, you're going way back trying to. Of course, as I mentioned, none of this is kind of legitimate, because some stuff they didn't know, they may have been confused about. But more importantly, at no point in here, by the way, does she still ever cite the hymn itself. She talks about Orphic hymn. She never puts down the hymn, never quotes the hymn, never cites the hymn, never says where it is. It's just never mentioned. As far as I know, she has not been able to identify the Orphic hymn in question, because she's never quoted it or cited it or anything. She just says it exists. Or at least she quotes sources that say it exists. And a lot of it's just like, long outdated. There's in fact, there's a one that's like a 16th, 17th century. There's someone here from, she starts quoting people from like this early 1600s. It's really weird. But the most amusing thing in here is she actually cites one modern book, one fairly recent scholarly work. And let me read the quote. It says, Dr. David M. Halperin et al. Note that Mise, who is androgynous or two-natured, is also associated with the goddess Cora Persephone as the variant name Mises. Well, yeah, Mises and Mise are actually referring to the same thing. What she doesn't mention is, well, there's a couple of things she doesn't mention. One is, in that book, at no point in that book is this Mise figure ever at all identified with Bacchus, or certainly not with Moses. That's just completely ridiculous. Okay, but more importantly, it's in that book. If you go look in there, it's quite explicitly stated that this is a goddess, that she's the daughter. And now, according to the particular myth, she has different mothers, but she's always female. So this could not be Bacchus. It certainly could not be Moses. And of course, as I mentioned anyway, this is like, post-New Testament, pretty much. But none of this is mentioned. But even worse, the thing that really just struck me as funny, because I wanted to check this, of course, and as expected, it's not what she says it is. It's just merely taking this little piece out of context. But the greatest thing of all is, as I mentioned, she says, Dr. David M. Halperin et al. Note. So you're figuring this is a book written by Dr. David M. Halperin, etc. This is a book, and she's quoting things that they wrote in this book. Well, when I got to take a look at the book, David M. Halperin et al. And others, they're not the authors. They're editors. It's a collection of essays by different people. The particular essay is Aspects of Bobo, the traditions or history and context, or something like that. And it's an article by Marisa Lender, not by Halperin. So obviously she has not actually looked at this with any great degree of she hasn't. She's just merely. It almost appears as though she's just merely used Google Books, put in the word Mises and came up with something and just. Because and now I want you to think about this. This is a book that's come out in the last year or so. a year and a year and a half. So she's had plenty of time to go find something to back this up, and she still hasn't quoted the hymn, still won't give the hymn. I did, and you'll see it in my earlier video. But this is what she comes up with. Need I say more? Thank you very much for your time.